Well, good morning, and welcome to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom's briefing on silencing religious freedom in Africa, the impact of speech restrictions. I want to thank Representative Jim McGovern and his staff for reserving this room for us this morning. I am Tony Perkins, chair of USERF. We have a couple of our other commissioners here with us this morning. First Vice Chair Gail Manchin is with us.
Thank you.
Our second Vice Chair,
Thank you.
Nadine Manza, is with us as well, and a number of the staff from USERF. As most of you are aware, we are an independent, bipartisan U.S. government body that monitors religious freedom worldwide using international standards. And from that, we make recommendations, policy recommendations to the U.S. Congress, to the administration, and to the State Department. Just by way of reference, the USERF was created by the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, or IRFA. USERF is not part of the State Department, which has its own ambassador at large for religious freedom, and the Office of International Religious Freedom, also created by the same act. We do closely work with the ambassador and his office. In fact, as a commission, we met with the ambassador yesterday. Now, we're glad to be able to hold today's briefing in celebration of International Human Rights Day, as we celebrate the anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights back in 1948. I wasn't there, but I've read a lot about it. We today reaffirm our commitment to upholding human rights, including the closely linked freedoms of religion and expression, which are enshrined in Article 18 and 19, respectively. Across the world, we see governments continue to find new ways to silence individuals. They block social media to keep people from expressing their views. They target and restrict religious groups whom they view as threats for various reasons. Even though some laws that impact free expression may be created with good intentions, such as to reduce hate or discrimination against certain groups, they should be carefully crafted and should not become tools of oppression in the hands of government. USERF's newest report on this topic is entitled Apostasy, Blasphemy, and Hate Speech Flaws in Africa. This report surveys speech restrictions in Africa and their impact on religious freedom, and includes policy recommendations to address the impact of these restrictions in Africa. Now, we have a great panel lined up for you today, and I would like to thank each of our panelists for being a part of this event. Each panelist will make some opening remarks on the topic, and then we will take questions and have what I hope to be a robust discussion this morning. First to speak will be USERF staff members and authors of the report, Kirsten Lavery, who is the International Legal Specialist, and Firdaus Bega, who is our policy analyst monitoring several countries in Africa. They will give an overview of the report and of the impact of speech restrictions on religious freedom in Africa. And then we'll hear from Mike Jobbins, the Associate Vice President of Global Affairs and Partnerships at Search for Common Ground, and Dunya Tegan with the Amnesty International USA to discuss strategies to combat discrimination and hate. So again, I want to thank all of our panelists for being here this morning, and we will start with Kirsten.
Great, thank you, Mr. Perkins. I'm Kirsten Lavery, International Legal Specialist at USERF. Firdaus and I greatly appreciate the opportunity to launch our report here today on Human Rights Day. I'd like to start by first framing the relevant international human rights standards and defining the speech restrictions that we've analyzed in our report, namely blasphemy, apostasy, and hate speech. USERF's definition of blasphemy is an act insulting or showing contempt or lack of reverence for God or sacred things. Blasphemy laws punish expressions or acts deemed blasphemous or defamatory to religion or religious symbols, figures, or feelings. We identified in our report 26 African countries with blasphemy laws, some of which previously had not been identified by USERF in our 2017 report tracking these laws. Mauritania also added a more specific blasphemy law, joining Iran and Pakistan as the only countries that impose the death penalty for this crime. For those of you tracking these laws globally, the new number of countries that USERF has identified is at 84, which is more than 40% of countries worldwide. While not enforced in every country, there are still serious human rights concerns with maintaining these laws on the books in Africa and elsewhere. And we'll be releasing a new list of the countries in the coming days. Apostasy is the act of renouncing one's religions. These laws are often broad and expand to acts beyond just renouncing one's faith, such as attempting to persuade others to change their religion. We identified 9 countries in Africa with apostasy laws, most of these in North Africa. Blasphemy and apostasy laws are both inconsistent with international human rights standards, as they violate the right to change religion and the right to discuss and even criticize religion. These laws also impermissibly protect religion, as international human rights law provides protection to individuals and not religions, beliefs, symbols, or religious symbols. One way to think about this is that human rights protects believers and not beliefs. Some other issues with these laws is they often impose harsh penalties. As we mentioned, Mauritania has the death penalty. They lack requirements of intent often and are vague and discriminatory. One example that we examined in our report is that Algeria's law criminalizing proselytizing, which is actively enforced, includes a ban on, quote, shaking the faith of Muslims. What is meant by shaking of the faith of a person is clearly open to debate and also relies on subjective feelings. This provision, as you can imagine, has had a grave chilling effect on religious activity and discourse in the country. Now, to turn to the last and most nebulous category of speech we discuss, hate speech. There's no international definition of hate speech, which has led to a lot of confusion about what this term means and what can actually be prohibited under international law. In our speech, we use a UN definition of in our report, of any communication that prejudice a particular group based on their race, religion, ethnicity, or another factor. We found 29 hate speech laws in Africa and 4 countries with pending legislation to criminalize this speech. Hate speech is a very broad umbrella term, and not all hate speech can be prohibited under international law. Legislation needs to strike a very delicate balance between allowing protected speech on one hand and at the same time protecting individuals and groups from harm. This is particularly important as an open and robust debate of ideas can be one of the best protections against religious intolerance. Only the speech most likely to spark violence, harm, and or discrimination can be very narrowly regulated. 2 categories of speech that our states are required to prohibit under international law that we discuss are direct and public incitement to genocide pursuant to the Genocide Convention, and any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence under Article 20, Section 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which we refer to in our report as imminent incitement. Outside these 2 categories, states can but are not required to limit broader hate speech under strict requirements that we discuss further. In our review, we found that hate speech laws are almost always vague and overbroad, which jeopardizes the freedom of speech. I'd also like to highlight one implication for the freedom of religion. We found that the effects of overbroad hate speech laws can be similar to blasphemy prohibitions, particularly when hate speech laws limit speech based on the subject matter rather than a contextual analysis to determine the likelihood of harm to an individual or group. Blasphemy, apostasy, and hate speech laws are often analyzed in separate categories, but one of our key findings is that they're often not as distinctly defined in text or in implementation. So with this in mind, I'll now turn it over to Firdaus to provide some additional examples.
Thank you, Kirsten. Thank you, Chair Perkins, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. Once again, as Kirsten mentioned, our research for this survey of speech laws in Africa revealed a large number of problematic laws that have the potential to restrict religious freedom. So rather than protect individuals' rights, as Kirsten noted, the laws are frequently being used to restrict free expression of opinion or belief. Despite states making numerous amendments to penal codes over the past 2 decades, apostasy and blasphemy laws have remained largely intact. In some cases, such as in Sudan and Mauritania, the laws have been amended to become more severe in 2015 and 2017, respectively, for Sudan and Mauritania. And also, states with state religions were more likely to have blasphemy and apostasy laws, and were more likely to receive higher or worse scores, using the indicators that we followed based on USERF's previous report respecting rights. In these states, as in others, the laws have been used to silence minorities, to protect dominant religious beliefs rather than individual rights, and to discourage or punish non-belief. In Mauritania in 2013, a blogger named Mohamed Khatir published an article about religion and racism, which the government regarded as blasphemy. He was sentenced to death, but in 2017, the Court of Appeals found that he had appropriately repented and ultimately ordered a lesser sentence. He was finally released this past July. In the case of Sudan, new clauses were added to the law in 2015, which you can read in the appendices of our report, making them even harsher, and further restricting the ability to criticize Islam or Islamic figures. Since the removal of Omar al-Bashir, however, from power this year and the appointment of new leadership in the transitional government, both civil society and officials have had new space and opportunities to work increasingly towards addressing these problematic laws in Sudan, which is very promising. So on the flip side, in both Sudan and Mauritania,